Much like Kubrows and the other Beast Companions, Sentinels have also been updated in Koumei and the Five Fates. The update mostly focused on upgrading their weaponry as opposed to upgrading themselves. Although there were a few bug fixes here and there and some updates to their general abilities to make them more usable. In this video, we're going to look at the Sentinels themselves instead of their weaponry. Aside from one case, all of the Sentinels can use every weapon. However, there are a few cases where the weapon that you pick is meaningful to the Sentinel that you decide to bring, so we'll talk about those in those cases. As always, I am Totama, and welcome to Terran House. Start with a general overview of all of the mods that the Sentinels bring to the table. There are a variety of general use utility mods such as Regen, Vacuum, and Guardian that can be used by all Sentinels. All Sentinels come with Assault mode, which is required in order for them to use their weapons. The exception to this is Diriga, who uses Calculated Shot since it has 70 meters versus the 30 of Assault mode. As with the Beast Companions, Sentinels have their own version of Vitality, Fiber, and Redirection to boost their defenses. Finally, Sentinels also have use to the different bond mods just like the Kubrows, Kavats, and other Beast Companions. Before we get into this tier list, I would like to remind everybody that this is my personal experience from my limited testing over the last 2 weeks of the Companions. Finally, I do want to mention that unlike the Beast Companions, Sentinel Companions do have a variety of forms, their regular form and their prime form. The main difference between a prime version and a regular version is just base stats and not actual functionality, so while I'm mentioning it here, it doesn't actually affect the rating of these companions. It's kind of a no-brainer to say use the prime because it's got bigger stats, but you gotta use what you have access to, and not everybody wants to spend platinum on a vaulted prime or to wait for it to come out. There's only one time where this actual stat change even matters, and we'll talk about it when we get to that Sentinel. With all that being said, let's get into the tier list. Easily the worst Sentinel, and maybe even the worst companion in the entire game, is Taxxon. Taxxon is by far probably even the worst companion in the entire game. You can acquire Taxxon through the Venus Junction on Earth. The benefit of Taxxon is he is literally the cheapest Sentinel, maybe even one of the cheapest items in the entire game, only taking Earth resources. Being a cheap early game Sentinel means that Taxxon really just does not scale too well. Part of this is because for some reason molecular conversion does not actually take into account Taxxon's weapon damage when calculating its own damage. And because molecular conversion's shield generation is based on the damage that's dealt, 200 base damage just does not scale. Any enemy with any meaningful amount of damage reduction will turn 200 into 10. Without another ability to fall back on, or even one that you can get from Cephalon Cimaris, it just means that Taxxon has no real output, especially since molecular conversion can get straight up outclassed by Guardian. Since Guardian has a fixed trigger when you run out of shields and always gives you 100% of your shields, it means that you're not left up to the mercy of Taxxon to actually use the damn thing, and it means that you'll actually get shielding from it. Here's the build I've been using for Taxxon, but honestly I couldn't even get footage of this guy using molecular conversion. That's just how inconsistent and bad the ability is. For real actual use, it's actually just better to replace Taxxon with Carrier the moment you can. Speaking of Carrier, next up we have Carrier, and by proxy Carrier Prime. While Carrier actually has some pretty decent natural bulk, the problem with Carrier is he's just too niche. His abilities are Ammo Case and Looter. Looter is actually a mod you have to go out of your way and go and get from Cimaris, and it just lets Carrier break boxes, but if you're trying to break boxes, you're probably bringing your frame like Limbo or Zaku to break the boxes anyway. Carrier's other ability is Ammo Case, which is basically just taking Ammo Drum and Ammo Mutation and putting them together into one. While this does give Carrier a nice niche of bringing up the ammo economy of some of your weapons, realistically this is a niche at best and not something that you're really looking for. Not to mention the fact that Ammo Case doesn't even work for battery weapons like the Tenet Cycron or Kit Guns, so at that point you just have Taxxon but beefier, so there's no real reason to use Carrier over another companion at that point. This is the build that I've been using for Carrier, and it pretty much just leans into him being a nice ammo drum. Could of course swap any of these mods out for Guardian if you would like, so that way he's also a shield bot, but I almost only ever use Carrier when I need extra ammo for something like the Kuva Brahma anyway, so I just don't see a point. Here in the video, if we pay attention, before I equipped Carrier, my ammo maximum on my Bratton is only 600, but as soon as he gets on there, 25%, we go up to 750 ammo maximum. The important thing to keep in mind here is ammo maximum is not magazine size. If it was magazine size, we would be having a different conversation altogether. Next up, we're going to talk about Oxulus. Being truthfully honest here, you could probably put Oxulus below Carrier because at least Carrier can be used for some ammo economy hurting weapons, whereas Oxulus has a very, very specific niche, but it's a nice one, so I gave him the edge. What Oculus does is points out the hot spots for the fishing spots in the open world zones while also applying the luminous dye to reveal the fish. It also has a Cephalon Cimeris mod Botanist, which allows it to scan plants for the silver grove dyes, but otherwise there's not really a reason to run Oculus. It is important to note that the luminous dye that Oculus applies is free. You don't actually have to buy it, but it's also a little bit more limited in range. However, there really is no reason to use Oculus unless you're going fishing. So I probably should have put Oculus below Carrier, but my list, my choice. Here's the list that I threw together, and while I have Scan Matter here, you really can replace that with just Animal Instinct, as they do the same thing, but Scan Matter does have an effect where it will pull in the loot that it ends up breaking from boxes, which is funny because that means that Scan Matter is essentially just Animal Instinct and Carrier's Looter put into one. If you bother farming Botanist from Cephalon Cimeris, unlike me, you would just switch Scan Aquatic Lifeforms for Botanist, as anywhere where you would be able to use one, you can't use the other anyway. Next up, we're going to talk about Worm, and oh boy, people are going to be controversial about this one, I think. Specifically, though, we do want to talk about Worm Prime. Worm Prime has 600 base shields, whereas Worm Regular only has 250, which means Worm Prime can actually use Reinforced Bond as long as you equipped Calculated Redirection. This lets us do the actual good thing that Worm is useful for, which is buffing your weaponry, and not what you might think. To get the common knowledge out of the way, crowd dispersion is just bad. Typically in Warframe, you want to keep your enemies together, and look at the airtime that guy got. He's all the way over in Timbuktu, and now I have to chase him down to kill him. The actual ability that people look at is the Cephalon Cimeris one Negate, which prevents a status effect from being applied to the Warframe every 5 seconds. The most recent update, DE made it so that this works with Manifold Bond to bring that 5-second cooldown down. However, it's still not that worth. Some status effects you can pretty much just ignore anyway, like Puncture and Impact, but what people are really going to want to use this for is to negate knockdowns that they don't have Prime Sure-Footed. However, that by extension means that if you have Prime Sure-Footed, Negate is useless, not to mention frames like Inaros, Revenant, Rhino, and Nidus, who are just straight up immune to status effects in the first place. However, thanks to Volok, the sniper that you can get from Dirga, giving you enough crit chance, that means that Worm becomes the best weapon buffing companion in the entire game, both boosting your fire rate with Reinforced Bond and your crit damage with Tenacious Bond. This is the build I've been running on both, but realistically you should drop Crowd Dispersion for any other mod you would like. I just think it's funny to watch enemies go 5,000 feet in the air, but it's not really practical at all. Easily you should just drop it and replace it with Manifold Bond, that way you can get Negate more often. Next up, we're going to talk about Jin. Jin has 2 mods, Fatal Attraction and Reawaken, and honestly, Fatal Attraction is not as good as you would think. Fatal Attraction causes Jin to draw enemies close and deal a minor amount of damage to them in an explosion and spread status, but it's really not as strong as you would think. The main benefit of Fatal Attraction is that it does force enemies to kind of group up, but not as good as other options that you have. Reawaken is essentially just a better version of Primed Regen, because it makes it so that whenever you pick up energy orbs, your cooldown on Jin will go down, so he'll respawn faster. However, don't be fooled by the fact that this gives him overshields. He is not a good user of Reinforced Bond. Honestly, personally, I find it very jarring whenever the overshields fall and suddenly I just lose 60% attack speed. However, thanks to Reawaken, he does have the benefit of being the companion with the lowest downtime whenever he goes down, since it's very easy to generate energy orbs and get them going so that way you can get this companion back up. That kind of does it for the lower tier and more niche companions. Let's talk about some ones that are almost always going to be good pickups, starting with Helios. Helios, and by extension Helios Prime, are the only companions in the entire game that can use Deconstructor Prime, a melee sentinel weapon. This means that Helios is the unique sentinel that can use Vicious Bond to be a nice armor-stripping monster. And thanks to its precept mod Investigator, it allows it to scan things into your codex for you, which is a nice touch-up. Especially when you consider that after something has been scanned into the codex, it's very easy to flip Investigator for Detect Vulnerability, which will mark a weak spot by this little blue glow that you can shoot for bonus damage. While passively scanning enemies and gaining the Cephalon Cimeris standing is nice, and being able to switch that for Detect Vulnerability once you're done is also a nice perk, there are just better options for more damage. Funnily enough, if it hadn't been for the recent armor changes, I actually would have rated him higher, but since armor stripping is just not as necessary to bust through hard targets anymore, it's really hard for his armor strip to be worthwhile. Especially when compared to some of the other contenders on this list, including the next up, Shade. I will preface this by saying that Shade comes in 3 different variants, being Shade, Shade Prime, and Prisma Shade that's available from Baroque Katir. The best one is Shade Prime, and we're going to act as if we're only talking about that one. Shade comes with Ghost by default, and you can purchase Ambush from Cephalon Cimaris for his standing. Ghost is easily one of the most broken things in the entire game, as it cloaks you and then you can use certain Warframe abilities without ever breaking the stealth in the first place, so you can basically nuke entire rooms as Saren without ever being revealed. And then if you do reveal yourself one way or another, Ambush will increase your weapon damage for 3 seconds after you break that invisibility, including the weapon damage from Shade itself. The only real problem with this is it does take a brief moment for Ghost to actually kick in and cloak you. If you're already being shot at, the enemies are already going to be alerted, so it can be kind of hard to maintain the stealth aspect of it. Here's the build that I've been running on Shade. Personally, I like to use the Volok, that way we can use Tenacious Bond to up our weapon damage even further, along with Ambush increasing it. Overall, a great companion for defense, but if we're talking about offense, it's hard to beat Death Cube. Death Cube comes with the preset mod Vaporize, and then you can purchase Energy Generator from Cephalon Cimaris. The most recent update made it so that Vaporize actually does deal Death Cube's weapon damage with the 600 base damage, so it actually can do some pretty meaningful damage, even if not as much in the Steel Path. The real value of Death Cube isn't actually Vaporize's damage, it's Energy Generator, since you can pair this with basically any AoE Sentinel weapon and just farm energy off of Death Cube. Honestly, I should probably put Death Cube lower on the list than Shade, but I personally don't find it a huge deal to be invisible as much as I do the energy econ that Death Cube can provide. That symbol in the top right corner that has the cube with the number under it, that's Death Cube's kills or assists, which tell you when he's going to drop an energy orb. Here's the build I've primarily been running with Death Cube, but you do have some flexibility here as well. Funnily enough, the companion named Death Cube isn't even the most lethal of the companions that we're talking about today. That would be Dirga, our next contestant. I would be remiss if I talked about Dirga and didn't talk about the Volok, the sniper rifle that it comes with, since it's the primary way that the Sentinels are able to proc Tenacious Bond. Dirga is also the first one on our list that has 2 preset mods, and none of them do you have to get from Cephalon Cimaris. The first one being Electric Pulse, where Dirga will fire basically a taser and keep zapping an enemy, stun locking it. The other being Arc Coil, which causes Dirga to just fire off waves and waves of electric energy as if it was a Tesla coil. This is mainly useful for frames that need some extra CC and priming, but hey, priming is always going to be useful, especially if it's electric damage, since there's not a lot of reason to either run mono electric or use a pure electric weapon. Of course, it also does come with Calculated Shot, which basically has more than double the range of Assault mode, so it can actually make use of the fact that he comes with, a sniper rifle. Dirga is interesting because it's the first time we need to talk about mod priority on Sentinels. Mod priority basically means that the mod in the top left corner will be used more often than the one in the bottom right, and it kind of does the Z as if you were reading a book. So the top left to the right, and then tier 2 left to right. Being the most optimized use would be a loadout like this. Of course, if you value either Electric Pulse or Arc Coil one over the other, you would want to just flip their locations on your mod order. That way that Dirga will prioritize the first one over the second one. Finally, our first place winner is Nautilus. You would think that Nautilus actually wouldn't rank that high, since at first glance it appears that Nautilus would be a niche frame meant to help you with Railjack thanks to its precept Auto Omni. However, as soon as we look at Cordon, its second ability, we can see why Nautilus is easily at the top of this list for me personally. Being the opposite of Worm's Crowd Dispersal, Cordon actually groups enemies up so that you can explode them all in one go, as demonstrated here. Pairing this up with an AoE weapon and then pairing that with Manifold Bond means that you can basically get the Cordon ability down to a 0-second cooldown and constantly be grouping enemies. And since Cordon essentially throws a tether grenade into a spot, it's not like the enemies are going to overshoot this. In fact, they'll get pulled back into it even for a few seconds after it was initially cast. You can pair this with Mystic Bond to give yourself a free ability cast as well. These are the mods that I run on Nautilus, but feel free to change around. The real only requirement is that you have Cordon and Manifold Bond, and of course, Vacuum. One final reminder that this is of course my opinion. You can disagree with me and that is absolutely fine. But yeah, that's the end of the video. Leave your comments, let me know what you think. If you disagree or agree, maybe you put something like Shade higher up on the list than I did. Also, for those wondering, no, I did not forget about Predasites. I want to cover Predasites and Vulpaphylas in their own video together since they both come from Deimos. However, with that being said, with the holidays coming up, I'm probably going to end up doing the Kavat since there's far less of them than there are the 6 that I would have to do for Deimos. But yeah, that's the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See ya!